My dad died nearly 2 years ago, and we just buried him today. He was a writer, though you've probably never heard of him. He was known in small circles, celebrated by the community where he lived, but his books will likely never grace the shelves of Barnes & Nobles. I say that like it's a fact, but that may not be the case anymore. Dad, much like one of those painters from the 1800s, became infinitely more famous in his death than he ever was in life. People who wouldn't return his calls, wouldn't even think of publishing his work, now come to see him from miles away. This probably seems strange, given that I just told you that he's dead, so let me start at the beginning. Dad died as he lived, at his keyboard. He's been writing the same book for as long as I can remember. It's a massive 7 or 8 volume series. In one of my earliest memories, I can remember toddling into his office and looking up at him as he smiled down at me, his fingers never leaving the keyboard as he plinked away. Dad wrote other things for magazines or freelance work, but the books were his magnum opus. He would tell anyone who would listen, usually interested friends of mine who were aspiring writers themselves, how the book would be the greatest work once it was done. He had envisioned 10 books in all, detailing the hero's journey of his main character as he attempted to find his father's murderer across several continents, meeting people and finding clues along the way. I've heard him talk about that book almost every day since I was old enough to understand what he was talking about, but I couldn't tell you much about them. He never let anybody read them. He was so protective of them. I don't know more than a dozen people who were aware of its existence at all. That being said, he was always in his study when he had time, tapping away at the keys and refining his manuscript for the day that it would be picked up by an editor. I was the one who found him, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was getting ready for college, packing up my things, moving out, and I came to see if he would help me move some furniture onto the truck. He'd been in his office all day, and I kind of thought maybe he was mad at me. I know he didn't want me to leave. He was sad to see me go, but he had to understand that I had to go to college. I had a full-ride scholarship. I'd be a fool not to use it, and living on campus would give me access to resources I wouldn't have at home. It seemed like the best choice to move out, and I couldn't believe he couldn't see that. So when I stuck my head in and asked him, I was surprised when he didn't turn around. That only seemed to cement in my head the idea that he was mad at me. He had his back to the door, as he always did, fingers tapping away, and when he didn't say anything, I just stood there and looked at the back of his head for a moment. He had a bald spot forming, the hair receding away from the center, and I thought it was a little sad to watch my dad aging in such an obvious way. I asked him again, his fingers never slowing, but when he didn't say anything, I just went downstairs and managed to manhandle the desk into the U-Haul by myself. I decided I wouldn't bother him if he wanted to act like this. He would fold when it came time for me to leave, apologizing for acting like this, and we would have a hug before I drove off into the sunset. Around lunchtime, I looked at my now empty room and realized I was finished packing. Mom was at work at the post office, and I had planned to swing in and say bye on my way out of town. We had said our goodbyes that morning, with a lot of tears and hugging over breakfast, and Dad was the only one I still needed to say goodbye to. So I went upstairs again, saying I needed to leave and wondering if he'd give me a hug. His fingers just kept tapping away uninterrupted. "Come on, Dad," I said, stepping inside as he continued to ignore me. "I know you're bummed about this, but it's time for me to get out of here and make my own way. It's not like I'll never see you again. I'll be here for Thanksgiving. That's less than..." But when I put my hand on his shoulder, I noticed how cold it was. Dad had been up here for 3 days writing, and Mom said she didn't think he'd come to bed in all that time. That wasn't uncommon for Dad. He would hyperfixate on a project, or revisions for days at a time. His office was towards the back of the house on the 2nd floor, so without foot traffic or noise, he could lose himself for days as he worked. He usually came down for food after everyone was asleep, but I couldn't remember hearing him stumble around lately. I turned him towards me, his hands moving comically in front of him as he swung away from the desk, and as he came away, he began to scream as if someone was stabbing him. I stumbled away, taking in his long face and sunken eyes, and found myself running from the room as I grabbed the phone out of my pocket. Mom said she'd be home immediately, and as I waited downstairs, I could still hear him screaming in his office. She came home in a rush, going up the stairs 2 at a time, and when the screaming finally stopped, I breathed a sigh of relief. When she came downstairs, she asked me to come to his office. "I need to talk to you about something, and I think this should be a family decision." I came back to see that Dad was still staring at the screen of his MacBook, tapping away like we weren't even there. "I don't know how to explain this, but your father's dead." Looking at his fingers as they went about their tireless typing, I asked if she was kidding. Dad was clearly alive. His hands were moving, and I could see words on the screen forming coherent sentences. Were they playing a joke or something? None of what she was saying made any sense. I checked his pulse. He has no pulse, no vitals. He's gone, sweetie. But it appears that he's not quite gone. She tried to move him, and as she turned him away from the computer, I could see his lifeless face as it turned to regard me. His jaw had been hanging slack, his eyes open and staring, and as his hands came away from the keyboard, he started screaming all over again. It was deep and tortured, similar to the one he'd made before, and without even meaning to, I turned him back to the keyboard where his hands started typing again. I asked her what was going on, and Mom shrugged as she tried to come up with a reason for this. His book was important to him. You know that. I think maybe once he finishes it, he might stop on his own. I can't explain what's happening here, but I don't want him to die with his work unfinished. Your father kept saying it wasn't ready, but I'm going to send the first manuscript to his editor. Maybe once he sees it and someone puts it into print, he'll finally be able to rest. Either way, let's keep this between us, okay? I want your father to pass on without regrets, don't you?" I nodded, telling her of course I did. I wanted Dad to die in peace. "Then do him this last favor, and don't tell anyone what you've seen here. Promise?" I really didn't know how to feel about this, but I told her I wouldn't tell anyone, and she thanked me as she hugged me goodbye. I left in my U-Haul, unsure how to feel about the situation, but I kept the secret. I didn't come home for the next year. I came home for Thanksgiving, as promised, but the whole thing felt uncomfortable. Mom and I sat downstairs eating, her curious about how school was going, and me filling her in on my studies. As I ate turkey and tried to have a normal conversation over stuffing, all I could focus on was the tap-tap-tapping from upstairs. Mom had closed the door to Dad's office, something that I could never remember happening at any time in my life. But despite her best efforts, the tapping was still audible. There was a smell from the room at the end of the hall, and I was worried about her living in a house with a decomposing body. She said he hadn't decomposed much, but I think she might have been trying to spare my feelings. Worse than the smell, though, was the tapping. It never stopped. It sounded too loud to be from whole fingers. Despite this, Mom was in pretty good spirits. She said that Dad's first book was being edited, and his publicist thought it was likely to be ready for shelves by next year. He couldn't believe my dad had been keeping this gem to himself for so long, and I think that's when I really realized how few people Dad had shared his book with. She said the initial payment on the book had allowed her to pay some overdue bills, and she would send him the second book sometime next year. If I release them slowly, it won't seem so odd when he finishes, and I let them know that he's passed. I asked if his writing had slowed at all, and she said that he was typing all day and night. He never rests, and I've had to start sleeping in my noise-canceling headphones. The sound takes some getting used to, but I think I can put it out of my mind. I had meant to stay the week, but I ended up making excuses and leaving the day after Thanksgiving. The sound of the keys as they clicked away was becoming too much for me to handle. After that, I made excuses not to come home. I told Mom I had a paper due during Christmas and stayed on campus over the holiday. I took extra classes so I didn't have to come home on the semesters that I'd be able to take a break from. I still called her on the phone, but her conversations became shorter and shorter as time went on. The longer I was on the line with her, the more pervasive the clicking became, and it felt like I could hear it over the phone no matter where she was. Mom's mental state began to deteriorate as well. She'd sent the second book to his publicist, and he'd fast-tracked it after the first one had done so well. She deflected any sort of interviews or phone calls for Dad, telling them how shy and anxious he was. But people really seemed to want to pick his brain about the direction of the books, and they were becoming harder and harder to put off. She didn't sound like her usual self either. It was clear that she wasn't sleeping. She said the clicking was getting louder and louder the longer it went on. I tried to do some soundproofing on the office, but it never seems to help. I can't stand to be in there for very long. Even though he's looking at the screen, I can feel him watching me when I'm in there. I think I can hear something moving around at night, too. Mom took a deep breath, and I could almost see her looking in the direction of the office as she pitched her voice lower. I asked what she meant, afraid that maybe animals had gotten in to try to get at Dad's body, but she said it was just little sounds. You remember how he used to leave his office late at night to get food? Sometimes I feel like I can hear someone coming down the stairs in the wee hours of the morning. While I was listening to it the other night, I realized that I couldn't hear the keyboard anymore, and that scared me even more. She started crying then, and I think I had already decided to come home that weekend so we could sort this out. I hadn't come home in a long time, and I found a very different woman than the one I had found over Thanksgiving a year before. And why not? It had to be nerve-wracking, knowing you were sharing a house with a corpse. Mom looked like she had aged 20 years. Her hair, light blonde the last time I'd seen it, was threaded with gray and looked thinner than ever. Her skin sagged, and her eyes looked bruised from the bags under them. She was so thin to the point of emaciation, and I wondered if she had been eating. When she hugged me, I could feel her ribs pressing against me, and I decided then that something had to be done before I lost both my parents. I told her that we had to end this. I told her that we had to put him to rest, but she feebly resisted. He isn't done yet. He's still typing up there. I can't lay him to rest until he's finished. I asked her how long that would be, but she didn't seem to have an answer. I told her I was tired and wanted to rest, but after I heard her door close and the sound of her springs grumbling as she went to bed, I got up and went downstairs. I wanted to see what this thing was that was moving around after dark, and I knew just the place to hide. There was a small closet in the living room, a place for wrapping paper and old crafts Mom hadn't gotten around to yet. And after sliding some things around, I made myself comfortable and cracked the door. It took some time. I wished I had some coffee to keep me from dozing in the small, warm place. I was just starting to nod off, my phone showing 3:30 in the morning, when the landing at the top of the stairs creaked. Something glided down almost soundlessly, its body light as I pressed my eye to the slit in the door to see what it was. It was dark in the living room, the curtains drawn, but I didn't dare turn on my light. If it knew I was here, it might flee, and then I'd have nothing to report to Mom in the morning. Luckily for me, it jostled right past the closet door, and the creature was impossible to miss. It was thin, almost lacking dimensions, creaking as it ambled into the kitchen. I held my breath as it disappeared into the dim space, but the pale head was hard to miss. When it turned to look at the closet from the kitchen doorway, I feared I'd made a noise. When those empty eye sockets fixed on the door, I covered my mouth with my hands. When the creature creaked its way into the kitchen and disappeared from sight, I tripped out of the closet and made my way less than gracefully back up the stairs and into my old room. If it heard me, it didn't stop at the door to comment. Only then did I come to the same conclusion that my mother had, realizing what was missing from the silent house. The tapping had stopped. We called the police the next day, me threatening to call them myself if Mom didn't. I didn't know what that thing was I'd seen the night before in the kitchen, but I couldn't very well leave her alone with it. She just nodded and picked up the phone. I think she was ready to call them, honestly. She lived with Dad's corpse for 2 years, and even she had to agree it was time to end it. The paramedics weren't sure what to make of him, but he was definitely what I had seen the night before when it came into the kitchen. He had almost completely rotted, but his bones had moldering flesh still attached in places. His scalp had some hair clinging to it. The bald spot I had noticed was still visible, but we had taken his hands off the keyboard before they got there. When we had taken him from the computer, his scream was little more than a wheeze of protest. He had no vocal cords to scream with, but still, he protested. The police had questions, but I think Mom managed to convince them that it was all harmless. She said that when he died, she had just gone a little bit crazy. She couldn't cope with him being gone, so she just pretended he was in his office, typing away on his novel. I told them that that was what she had told me for months, and I think they believed me. Dad's remains were taken to the funeral home, and it goes without saying that his funeral was a closed casket affair. As we sat on the front row, though, I heard something that would haunt me until I went into the ground myself. Dad may not have been able to scream, but it seemed his work went on regardless. As I sat there with Mom, my mother sobbing as she heard the all-too-familiar sound, we both heard the low tapping of those bony fingers smacking against the lid of the coffin. I can only assume that they still press against the lid even now, my father's last story worn into the wood of his coffin. The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. We all tried our best to look appropriately terrified, but it was all mostly for show. Jesse liked to tell stories, but none of them were really that scary. The five of us were gathered around a flashlight in our bunkhouse, telling scary stories and generally just creeping each other out. Mike had a sack of junk food he'd snuck in, and Paul had a bottle of pop. We were enjoying just hanging out together more than any of the stories. These were the moments I looked forward to, the gathering of friends as we hung out for the summer. I've been going to Blue Lake summer camp for about 4 years now, and what I looked forward to the most was spending time with the friends I only got to see at the camp. Jesse, Paul, Steve, and Mike, we had all been going to camp for about the same amount of time, and we'd become fast friends. They all lived in different places and didn't go to school with me, so the only time I got to see them was at summer camp. I didn't have a lot of friends at school, so I lived for their emails and the summers I got to spend with them. "That story sucks," came a voice from the back. We all looked up to see the sixth member of our cabin, Terry Woods, as he lay under his covers reading a comic book. Terry had been coming to camp for about as long as I can remember. He was a weird kid who never really got along with anyone. He'd been through 4 different cabins in 4 years, and I guess it was our turn to get him. He was quiet, didn't really do sports, and just kind of seemed like a creep. He was constantly hiding in the bushes and making people feel uncomfortable, and the counselors had even caught him peeking into bathroom stalls before. They kept talking about kicking him out, but every year he showed up with his bag and a check, so they let him stay. It's probably the only break his parents got from him, and who could really begrudge them a little downtime? Jesse turned to Terry and fixed him with a frustrated look. Jesse hated hearing that his stories were lame, even though most of them were. "All right then, smart guy, why don't you come tell a story? Show us what a real scary story looks like." Terry seemed to think about it for a minute, before putting down his comic book and walking over to sit on the bed with us. We made a space for him that was a little too big, since none of us really wanted to sit next to Terry. He looked into the flashlight beam, and it was like being around a campfire. The light made his skin pale and ghostly, and when Terry looked up, we all sat back a little in surprise. He looked like a corpse, and he seemed to know it. "You guys ever hear the story of the Whispering Hole?" A few of us shook our heads, but Paul nodded. "Some of the older boys told me about it. It's a hole in the woods, and they say you can hear Indian ghosts in it or something." Terry nodded, grinning a little. "Legend says that it's not Indian ghosts in that hole. The story I heard was that long, long ago, a bunch of superstitious farmers buried their kids out there to appease a forest spirit so he would give them good crops." We all leaned in close now, expecting a good story with a lead-up like that. "They say when the land was first settled and all the Creek Indians were safely chased out of the woods, the crops began to fail. An old woman, whom the townsfolk suspected was a witch, told the people that they had angered a forest spirit, and now their crops would do badly. When they asked what they had to do to bring the crops back, she said that they must take one of their children for every year they had settled here and bury them in a deep hole in the woods. Only then would the crops grow again and the spirit would be appeased. We had leaned in closer, our shadows magnified against the roof of the cabin. The townsfolk realized that this meant 8 of their children would need to be sacrificed. So through a lottery, they decided which 8 must be taken. The rich tried to buy their way out, and the poor tried to beg their way out. But in the end, those whose names were drawn were taken to the woods. They were led there by the witch, and some of the men from the village came along too. Suddenly, the ground opened up to accept their sacrifice, and they herded the children into that space. When the last one fell into the earth, the forest erupted in a mighty roar. The crops grew, and the town prospered. But if the townspeople needed to be reminded of the price they paid for their prosperity, they had only to visit the hole in the woods and hear the whispers of the children. The town is gone now, but the hole whispers eternally. We sat in silence for a moment, all of us looking at each other as the story came to an end. Terry had created something special here, but none of us believed it. It was just a story, plain and simple. Or so we thought. "Wow," Jesse said. "Gotta give it to you, Ter. That was a good story." "Oh, it's no story," Terry said. "The hole exists. I've been there." We were silent for a few seconds. Then we all began to laugh, thinking Terry was just making a joke. All of us, except for Terry, that was. As the laughter died, we all looked at his deadpan stare and realized he was serious. "You want to go?" Terry asked. The 5 of us looked at each other. Did we want to go out in the woods with someone we didn't quite trust and didn't really like? I already figured I knew how the rest would answer, but when Jesse spoke up, it came as a bit of a surprise. "Sure, let's go see this whispering hole. You're in, right?" he said, looking right at me. I surprised myself by nodding, but the other 3 shook their heads almost at once. Mike was afraid. "It could be dangerous out there. I don't think I want to go." Steve was condescending. "There's no whispering hole. Terry's just trying to play a trick on us, guys." Paul was sensible. "We should get some sleep, guys. Counselor Hank said there was going to be a big hike tomorrow, and we don't want to be tired for it." In the end, though, Jesse wouldn't be turned away, and I certainly wasn't going to let him go by himself. So, Terry, Jesse, and I snuck out of our cabin and trotted off into the woods with only the moon to guide us. "So," Jesse asked, "where is this whispering hole?" "Not far," Terry said, leading the way. "The camp's actually pretty close. It's about a mile, I guess." Jesse balked at that. "A mile? That could take us nearly an hour in the dark." Terry grinned that same jack-o'-lantern grin at him. "Then I guess you better start walking and stop talking." Then he headed off into the woods, and it was either follow him or turn around. At this point, turning around didn't seem like much of an option, so Jesse and I went. The woods were alive in a way that we had never seen during the day. I saw a pair of eyes looming overhead a second before an owl took flight. The crickets hit a reeing point that was close to eye-watering. The sounds of squirrels and birds were replaced by night creatures that were just beginning to come alive. With the moon on high and the wind rustling the overhead canopy, we felt immersed in an alien world the deeper we went into the woods. This was different than the camping we did. This felt almost dangerous, and it was exhilarating to 3 young boys in the woods alone at night. We followed Terry for about 45 minutes, all of us sweating and waving off the clouds of mosquitoes, before Jesse asked him if he was lost. "No, I know where we're going. It's just a little farther." He had picked up a large limb and was using it as a makeshift machete as he thwacked at the branches. I had found a stick of my own, a large one that I was using as a walking stick, and I saw Jesse looking around for a stick of his own. The way he was doing it, though, made it seem weird. He wasn't looking around in that lackadaisical way that kids look for sticks. Jesse seemed to be looking for a stick with a purpose. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Jesse started to answer, but grinned as he found a big stick that looked like a club. He picked it up and took some test swings before turning back to me. "Much better now. I feel way better now that I have something to defend myself with." "You hear something following us?" I asked, looking around to see if I could spot it. "It's more what we're following. I don't really know, Terry. Do you?" I shook my head, ducking a low-hanging arm of a pine bough, and yet Here we are, following him into God knows what. You buy his story about a whispering hole? I don't know. Not really, I said with a little shrug. So then, where's he really taking us? Is this some kind of psycho crap? I want to be ready if it is. I realized that I had done the same thing without thinking about it, and tested the end of my walking stick against the dirt. It was a sorry excuse for a walking cane, but I supposed it was better than nothing. Watching the back of our guide, I suddenly wondered if we could take Terry if it came to it. Terry was fat, but he was also bigger than either Jesse or I. I had seen him play soccer once, and he seemed slow and easily winded. If he got his hands on you, though, I wondered what might happen. He could probably hurt one of us really bad, and then it would be up to the other to either fight him off or run for help. At a mile, I didn't like the thought of having to run all the way back to camp, but I liked the idea of running while Terry stalked me through the woods even less. It didn't matter, though. Not really. Once we came to the hole, it was all irrelevant. The closer we got to our destination, the quieter it seemed to become in the forest. The sounds of night birds and insects softened at first, like sounds heard with the TV volume turned down. But the deeper we went, the more they seemed to become actually silent. We were soon walking through a silent forest, and it made my skin crawl. Forests aren't supposed to be like that, and the idea that something actually lay ahead made me break out in goosebumps. What could it be that had scared all the wildlife away? What could it be, and what would it do to 3 kids who just wandered into its territory? Terry suddenly stopped, declaring that we were there. He stepped past a little ring of trees, and we followed him. Terry had the stick balanced on his shoulder, but when we came into the open space, he pointed at the hole with the gnarled branch. There it is, boys, the whispering hole, just like I promised. We turned to look, and I could see Jesse's fingers were white as he clutched his club. When we saw the hole, though, those fingers seemed to become boneless, and the stick spilled out of them. He stepped towards the hole like a drowning man paddling for a raft, and I felt equally as moved. The whispering hole wasn't a hole at all. It was like nothing so much as a grave. The grave was about 6 feet tall and 6 feet across. The earth had not been dug out, despite the amount of it sitting on either side of the hole. The way it looked, the earth had simply spat the dirt out like a mouthful of spinach, to have its mouth free of the taste. The pit was deep, too, and Jesse and I bent over to look down into the black mouth of that chasm. The whispering was slight, sounded more like a babbling brook than actual whispering. Jesse made a rude noise, looking back at Terry as he rolled his eyes. It's just an underground river. You drug us all the way out here to show us an underground river? Terry shrugged, but his grin never faltered. It's the whispering hole. Have a listen. They say you can hear the voices of those dead kids down there. Jesse bent over, listening to the sound coming up, but that seemed like a great way to topple into the hole. Instead, I laid down on my stomach, putting my ear over the hole and listening to the sounds inside. I had worried about the edge of the pit crumbling and sending Jesse falling in, but the edge of the pit seemed to be made of stone. It reminded me of nothing so much as one of those random caves you sometimes find in Minecraft. Those openings in the earth that just wait to be found. I had wanted to see if I could squint and see the bottom, but it was too far down to see anything. I wondered how we were hearing the water when a voice whispered up into my ear. Beware, he's gonna push you in. I looked down into the pit and then over at Jesse, who was straining his ears and looking in. Who had said that? He's pushed so many into the whispering hole. Sometimes it's people he knows. Sometimes it's people from camp. But it's always him. Get out. Get out while you still can. I turned to see if Jesse was hearing this, but that was when Terry made his move. I looked up just in time to see him shove Jesse with both hands, sending him falling into the hole. I rolled before I could really think about it, and it saved me from getting a tennis shoe to the face. Terry was still smiling, but his foot was coming down again and again as he tried to stomp me. I was scared, moving purely off adrenaline, and when I sprang back to my feet, he lifted his stick like he meant to club me. He didn't say anything. He just ran forward with that gnarled branch he had been using to clear the path. I threw my own stick at him and turned, running into the woods as I tried to make it back to camp. I had to let someone know what had happened out here. I ran through the forest like a startled deer, but it seemed like something was stalking me. Something big was behind me, and the farther I ran, the louder and more frantic it became. I felt like Snow White as I ran through the woods, The once enchanting landscape, now little more than a nightmare forest that grabbed at me with every step. The pine boughs whipped my face, the rocks and palmettos sliced at my shins, and the constant rustling of something behind me kept me on edge. Every time I would think about stopping or slowing down, I would hear it and it would pique my adrenaline again. I could have run for hours as I dodged the large something, but eventually I saw the familiar lights of the camp not far ahead of me. The closer I got, the more I expected that frantic rustling to crop up again. It had seemed to chase me all the way from the whispering hole, and I could just see Terry stalking me as he tried to stop me from tattling. What would he do if he caught me? Would he club me with that branch? Or would he just drag me back to the hole and toss me in? When I broke free of the woods and made it back to those familiar cabins, I felt blessed indeed. The scoutmaster came after a few minutes of steady knocking, and he looked grumpy. When I told him what had happened, though, he woke up pretty quick. He pulled me into the cabin and took my statement as he called the police. The police came and had me take them to the whispering hole immediately. Most of them looked like just regular cops, but a few had bags of climbing gear for spelunking. The scoutmaster and I went with the 8 officers and 1 dog, and as the woods got quieter again, I knew we were getting close. When we came into the clearing, I didn't see any sign of Terry anywhere. The guys with the bags looked over the edge of the hole, and with their spotlights, they found Jesse as he lay at the bottom. I was so afraid that he was dead, but one of the officers said that he was moving some when they shone the light on him. They told me later that we had both been very lucky, since Jesse had fallen almost 50 feet into the underground cave. Both his legs were broken, badly broken at that, and he had hit his head pretty hard, but he was alive. The guys with the bags went down to get him, a stretcher coming down on a cord, and when they got there, one of them said that they'd need some body bags after they got the kid airlifted out. There's about 6 other bodies down here, and all of them look like children. Most of this stuff the police either asked me about, or it was stuff that I picked up when I wasn't supposed to be listening, but it paints a pretty grisly picture of Terry's crimes. Well, not Terry, I guess, since there is no Terry. Terry had taken 6 other kids to the hole, 2 of them campers from the previous year, and just shoved them in. He had made up the story of the whispering hole to take other kids out to the spot so he could push them in and listen to them die. A few of the bodies had clearly died on impact, but the coroner said that a few of them had probably lived for a day or 2 as they sat out there dying. The sicko had probably come to check up on them as they lay bleeding to death, and it appeared he had meant to make us his next 2 victims. There's a manhunt going on right now for Terry, but the camp has relatively little information on him. The address they have goes to an empty lot in a trailer park. Terry pays by cashier check every year, and the phone number they have on file goes to a disconnected number. They've never met Terry's mother or father, and they have no idea where he lives. They know that he lives close to the Whispering Hole, but the chances of finding him might be slim if he lives in the woods somewhere with relatives. The camp has agreed to call if he turns up, but camp is definitely canceled this year for Jesse and I. Mom says I can visit him in the hospital if I want, and the paramedics told me that he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for me. So do yourself a favor and don't listen to any stories about the Whispering Hole if they're told around the campfire this year. Terry will need a new hunting ground, and he may be coming to a summer camp near you. When I was a kid, I had a pretty typical suburban childhood. White picket fences, ticky-tacky suburban houses, endless concrete for my friends and I to ride our bikes on, and the only strangers we saw were the occasional drifters or travelers that wandered through our town. My dad worked at the steel mill. My mom was a homemaker. I remember afternoons off from school filled with bike rides and trips to the arcade, Boy Scout meetings, and exploring Stokes Woods that lay just off the secluded neighborhood we all lived in. Stokes Woods was where my friends and I had so many firsts. It was honestly the first bit of real freedom we had. We spent summer days exploring, making maps and setting up camps that would be found later to our great amusement. It was our first brush with death, too, finding birds or animal carcasses on the trail. We poked at them with sticks and oohed at the bugs that crawled out. We never guessed that one day we might share their fate. I was in the woods the first time I swore, yelling, "Damn it!" as I skinned my knee when I was 8. I was in those woods the first time I saw a naked lady. The glossy pages of Terry's dad's Playboy gripped in my sweaty hand as we sat around the campfire when we were 11. It hosted my first camping trip, It was the first place I was allowed to camp alone. Well, with Terry and Reggie, but it was our first time out alone at night. It was also where we found the treehouse. The treehouse was a relic of kids gone by. It was in a big old tree set into a clearing, a fire pit dug in its shadow. It had a dumbwaiter to pull things up, and a rope ladder to climb up through a trapdoor. It was built in pieces. There was a wall inside with the signatures of kids who had added to it, complete with dates when they had completed them. When we came across it one afternoon, our 9-year-old eyes grew big with wonder. We knew we had found something special that day. Over the next few weeks, we replaced the rope ladder, cleaned out the fire pit, and replaced the dumbwaiter rope. We painted it too, finding some paint at the junkyard and painting the faded treasure in a wash of purple and brown and gold. We added a bike rack, again with the wood from the junkyard, and signed our names and dates on the wall when the project was done. The easy trip to and from the junkyard made me believe that the treehouse might have been constructed from the things they found there. We asked Old Man Macy, the caretaker, and he said that kids had been coming and going from the dump for years. He said every few years some kids would come along and take wood and pipes and things for special projects they did out in the woods. He was honestly glad they had been putting it to good use. We'd been playing and camping and using the treehouse for a couple of years when Terry suggested a Halloween sleepover. It's on a Friday. We can camp out in the treehouse and eat candy and tell scary stories. I thought it sounded like a great idea, and my parents agreed. 3 kids alone in the woods may seem weird to some of you, but the town we lived in was pretty rural. Our town had a population of about 1,200, and the crime was almost non-existent. Besides the odd traveler that sometimes blew through, you knew your neighbors pretty well. We had camped in the woods for the last 2 years, and the Boy Scouts had taught all of us how to camp safely and not burn down the woods. That night, we all hit the street as soon as the lamps came on. We set out with our pillowcases in hand and embarked on a sweet journey to collect the most candy. As always, we had a theme, and we were all dressed as the Avengers when we went out trick-or-treating. I was Hawkeye, bow slung over my shoulder, handmade costume and cheap mask covering my eyes. Reggie was the Hulk, body painted green and absurd rubber hands over his real ones. Terry was Captain America, his store-bought costume topped off by a trash can lid that he had painted a star on. We moved from house to house, striking poses and delighting adults as they filled our pillowcases with candy. By the time the porch lights started going out, we had bulging sacks ready to burst from all the candy we'd gotten. We stopped at our homes, dropping off a little excess candy and getting our camping stuff. We told our parents where we were going, and my mom kissed me goodnight and told me to come straight home if there was an emergency. And with that, we set off. We walked the familiar trails into the woods. Our backpacks were bulging with our candy sacks, and the night was lit by a full and ghostly moon. Terry and Reggie talked excitedly about the candy, wanting to tell ghost stories as we ate it. But I kept getting distracted. I could swear there was a noise out in the woods, a bird or a high-pitched wind. As we moved towards the treehouse, it seemed to follow us. The other 2 were oblivious, but the sounds made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It came closer and closer, never quite reaching us, but seeming to pass us sometimes. I heard it behind us, heard it in front of us, and how the others could remain oblivious of it was beyond me. When the treehouse rose up to greet us, it was a real relief. In the light of the full moon, though, it looked ghostly and strange. I had thought the noise would cease to be an issue once we arrived, but it only seemed to get worse. As we loaded our bags on the dumbwaiter, I could swear the whistling still surrounded us. I rushed them a little, gaining some grumpy looks, but I wanted to be out of the woods and into the safety of the treehouse. Once we were safe inside, lanterns on and candy spilled on the floor, I began to feel at ease. This was our sanctuary. Nothing bad could happen to us here. We were children who had yet to experience loss or any real trauma. We were secure in our knowledge that our parents would still protect us from anything, no matter how bad it got. We were foolish, but children are supposed to be foolish, I guess. Reggie was halfway through one of his full-size candy bars the Hudsons had been passing out when Terry suggested we start the ghost stories. Terry loved scary stories, and he usually had a pretty good collection of them from the internet or wherever. Reggie pulled a beanbag chair over from the corner, and I dragged a camp chair over so I could join the group of lanterns. Typically, we would tell our stories around the fire pit, but I think we all sensed that tonight it would be better to be inside. Halloween was unique somehow. It was best to be inside after dark. Terry brought the flashlight up under his chin, tilting the light knob down on the lantern and grinning at us ghoulishly. "This is a true story. I swear it on my life," he said, before beginning his story. He told us a story about a kid plagued by the ghost of a hobo that he and his friends had accidentally killed. They had been playing a trick on him, and he had choked to death on a sandwich. After he died, the boy kept seeing him around, in windows or on street corners, but his friends hadn't believed him. Then, while the boys were at a sleepover, the ghost struck. I found myself distracted as he told the story, though. The wind blew against our treehouse, creaking it in the branches of the old tree. But beneath the wind, there was a weird sound. That same whistling was coming from outside, a high-pitched keening that was not altogether tuneless. As I listened to it, it almost seemed to move through the surrounding trees as Terry wove his tale. Terry came to the end of his story, and the boy's friends died badly. The boy escaped the sleepover and ran for his home. The ghostly hobo dogged his heels, screaming his name as he chased him through the quiet streets. But the boy had made it home and slammed the door in his rotting face. He had leaned against it, safe at last, but as the banging began, he remembered one important fact. His parents were gone, Terry said, grinning in the flashlight beam. He might have made it home, but he was still at the mercy of the ghostly apparition. Terry told us how the door had bowed inward, the ragged hands pushing the wood like wax paper, but I felt my attention dragged away again. I could still hear the whistling, closer now, and I could swear there was another noise too. Rustling leaves maybe, or leaves crackling underfoot. Was someone outside the treehouse? And as Patches pushed at his door, trying to catch him, the boy snuck out the window and disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Terry seemed to notice then that I wasn't really paying attention. "Oh, come on, that was a great story." "Huh?" I asked. Oh yeah, something was just distracting me outside." Reggie looked quizzically at me. What was it?" "I thought I heard someone outside moving around in the leaves." Terry turned to look at the bare window, and Reggie walked over to look out into the inky blackness. The moon cast an odd light over his face, but as he scanned the ground, it gave away no sudden surprise. He shrugged his already broad shoulders and returned to his beanbag chair. He reached for a candy bar and started unwrapping the silvery foil. "Nothing there," he said after Terry and I stared at him for a second. "Must have been the wind." Terry had begun another story about a shadowy creature that lived in a stairwell. As he laid out the narrative, though, I could hear the whistling again. It wormed into my consciousness, spinning through the trees outside like a drunken bird. I could hear the leaves crunching again, the wind making them rustle like skeletal wind chimes. And suddenly, I too wanted to go to the window and look out into the night. I was trying to listen to Terry's story, but the more I tried to pay attention to it, the more I heard the noises from below. Terry looked miffed when I interrupted his story to drag up the rope ladder. I latched the hatch and came back to find him with his arms crossed and an indignant look on his face. "Think you can do a better story? Well then, hotshot, have at it." He tossed the flashlight at me, and I caught it by reflex. I thought about it for a minute and realized I did have a story I could tell. Maybe by getting it out, I could alleviate the fear that had been consuming me. I was ruining my Halloween campout, and for what? Some noise outside the treehouse? It was probably just a raccoon or something that we had spooked when we arrived. My unease had given me the perfect story, though. So, these three kids were walking in the woods. They were going camping, and were going to a familiar spot in the woods to set up. They left their homes at dusk, wanting to camp out under the stars in just their sleeping bags. Their parents told them that if anything went wrong, they could come home and sleep there. But the boys had done this 100 times, and felt that they knew the woods like the back of their hand. They felt like nothing in the woods could surprise them. But they were wrong. Terry sneered, but he sat close to the lantern and listened nonetheless. Reggie opened another candy bar, the story drawing him in as the stories almost always did. Reggie didn't really seem to like scary things. He was kind of a fraidy cat, but he liked stories. He would sit and listen, getting more and more terrified, but always beg for another when you were done. They walked towards the determined campsite, talking animatedly about the s'mores they would make and the scary stories they would tell. One of them kept hearing something as they walked. He could hear a snap of a twig, the crunch of a leaf, and it made him wary. He told his friends, but they shrugged it off as nothing. It was late afternoon, the sun was setting, and the animals were coming out to forage. They were probably just hearing animals moving around in the dry leaves. The two of them went back to walking, talking between themselves, but the third kept listening, kept looking over his shoulder to see what lay behind. Terry and Reggie were paying attention, Terry a little begrudgingly. Reggie's eyes were large and starey as he listened. As I told the story, I almost thought I could hear the leaves crackling outside, the wind in the trees rattling the dying year's foliage against the limbs, and a low whistle could be heard outside. It was tuneless and wafting as it warbled across my sanity. I knew just what was stalking these kids through the woods as I began to spin their tale. He kept asking them to listen, telling them it was important, but they wouldn't listen to him. They kept walking, kept talking, and all the while the crunching leaves and the rustling of limbs followed them, getting closer and closer. The boy became afraid. The steps sounded large, but he couldn't see anything in the trees as they proceeded down the trail. One of the others finally yelled at him, telling him to stop being stupid and just enjoy the trip. There was nothing out there. No one but he could hear it. He was being dumb. He needed to relax. I paused for dramatic effect, seeing Terry roll his eyes at the description of the boy in the story. That's when they heard the whistling. And I imagined I could still hear the whistling outside the treehouse. It was getting closer and closer as I told the story. Was the story drawing it in? Was I calling it to the treehouse? But by now, though, I couldn't stop myself. The story needed to be told, and I had become a conduit for it. I would tell it to the end, even if the whistler came right up the tree after us. They all froze when they heard the whistling. This was no wind through the boughs of a tree. This was a tuneless, monotonous whistling that cut across the dying afternoon like a sickle through wheat. It was behind them, seemingly on the trail, and they could hear it getting closer and closer. They began to make their way towards the campsite, walking a little faster, but all three looked over their shoulder now. They were all made uneasy by the whistling, and they all wanted to put some distance between themselves and it. My friend sat forward, hanging on my every word, entranced by this new development. Outside, I imagined I could hear the whistling coming from just outside the clearing. They didn't talk anymore. They didn't laugh. They didn't joke. They let their feet take them ever onward, but the whistling followed them. The friends who had insisted it was nothing said that maybe they should speed up a little bit. The campsite couldn't be far. Once they were there, they could take a side trail and get back to town. Or whatever it was might leave and they could get back to their campout. The other two agreed, but all of them knew that the campout was already canceled. None of them would sleep here tonight, not willingly. They sped up, but the whistling followed them steadily. One of them said that they should stop and confront the whistler. He must be human. Who else could whistle? The other two shot him down, though. The whistling was discordant, jangling against their nerves, sounding like nothing they had ever heard before. Both agreed that they didn't want to find out what whistled like that, and they kept moving. Something bumped the bottom of the tree, but my audience didn't seem to notice. It wasn't a hard bump. It didn't shiver the whole tree. It felt more like an inquisitive tap, a gentle knock, someone trying to get our attention. I put it out of my mind, maybe the wind or something, and kept telling my story. They kept moving, deeper and deeper into the woods, all the time being chased by the whistling. They broke into a run, the campsite still not coming into view, and still the whistling grew closer and louder. The whistling took on a life of its own, rising and falling in its chaotic tune as it became less and less discernible. The children put their hands over their ears, the noise scraping against their mind like a rusty scalpel. The hands would not block out the whistling, though. They heard it inside their heads as it battered their senses, and when the first one tripped, the other two did not stop to help him. They didn't hear his screams, but they felt a change when the whistling thing got him. A night bird called out from the forest, but now the whistling was in my own head, and I only registered it as something different. I told the story frantically, hoping it would stop the whistling in my head somehow. They dropped their packs and ran. They sprinted, flat out, knowing that the trail must be up ahead. They would round the bend, and there it would be. It would be there, as it always had been, and they would cut back towards town. It never occurred to them that the creature could just cut through the forest after them. The trail to town had a talismanic effect on them. If they could make it, then they could walk it, and then they would be safe. They ran, they wept, but the whistling followed them on and on, their feet crunching against the leaves and pine needles, sounding like gunfire, but they hardly noticed over the eerie whistling in their heads. My two friends were leaning close now, the lantern making their faces look like jack-o'-lanterns as their eyes begged for the climax. And still, that whistling assaulted me, threatening to drive me mad. If they noticed it, they gave no indication. When the second boy fell, the first never noticed. He ran and ran, trying to outdistance the whistling, trying to get it out of his head, and when his friend was found, the whistling again took on a different note. The lone boy ran and ran, hoping to outdistance the crazed whistling, knowing that his fate would be the same as his friend's if it caught him. Some say he runs to this very day. Some say the whistling got him in the end. No one knows for sure. I heard the whistling abate a little. It didn't leave, but it did lighten slightly. I felt like crying as I came to the end of my story. Maybe I would be allowed to live where the boys had died. The search parties found their backpacks 2 days later, animals having worried at them to get at the food that was inside. They found the campsite bare, no fire having been lit in weeks. Of the boys, they found no sign. No trace was ever found. Not a scrap of clothes, not a footprint. They were never seen again, but the children in the area say that you can hear the whistling in the woods on quiet nights. On those nights, it's best to stay indoors. The whistling takes all who venture too close, and the whistling will haunt you for the rest of your life, however long that may be. That was when the whistling stopped. It stopped so abruptly that I wondered if it had ever been there at all. For a 10-year-old to question his mental stability was a strange feeling, but at that moment, I was just glad it had passed me by. The other two shook off their rapture, looking as though they had been hypnotized, and Terry blew out a long breath. Well, damn, that was a good story. I can't top that, and suddenly I'm feeling kind of tired. Yeah, Reggie said dreamily. Me too. Think maybe we should go to bed. I would have argued with them on most nights, but tonight I was as drained as the rest. We laid out our sleeping bags and burrowed down, dropping off quickly without the usual chatter that preceded it. I'd like to tell you that that's where the story ends. I wish I could, but that wouldn't be doing justice to the memory of my friends. I awoke in the wee hours of the morning when someone threw a pillow at me. It was not thrown playfully. The throw was hard, angry, and directed at my face. I sat up, rubbing my cheek, and became aware of the keening whistle that had returned. It was louder than ever, and it chilled me to the bone. For God's sake, stop it, Terry yelled, staring daggers at me. Your story was good. We all said so, but trying to scare us with that stupid whistling isn't funny. I heard someone crying and looked over to see Reggie in the corner with his hands against his face. The whistling was loud and discordant, just as I had described it in my story, and it appeared that I wasn't the only one that could hear it now. Terry looked madder than I had ever seen him,
and Reggie was clearly terrified after the story I had spun. "It's not me, I swear," I told them. Terry glanced at me for a few seconds before realizing that I was right. He had woken me up. How could I be the whistler? He moved to the window and I joined him, trying to see the source of the whistling. Most nights we would have nothing to see but the inky blackness, but under the light of the full moon, the yard was shadowy but visible. As we scanned the yard, we could see little. The fire pit below, the logs we sat at as we toasted our marshmallows and wieners, the woodpile we had tarped against the rain. I had almost decided to go check the other window when Terry gasped like a stepped-on cat. I looked and saw a man in a long cloak step out of the tree line. He was dressed in a dark gray coat, long and flowing like a trench coat, and a tall cowboy hat, making him look almost 7 feet tall as it poked towards the sky. The toes of his pointy boots poked from beneath the coat, and I thought they looked battered and scuffed even from here. The wind seemed loath to touch him, but by the way he pulled the cloak around him, you'd have thought he was freezing. I could see a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight as they looked up at us, and decided that he must be wearing glasses. Of him, we could see very little under the cloak, but he made us uneasy. The whistling seemed to be coming from beneath the cloak, and when it stopped, he began to speak, and I wished for the whistling again. His voice was raspy, pinched, croaksome, a dead man's pleading last words. "It's so cold, boys. Might I take shelter in your treehouse for the night?" I shuddered, not knowing what to say. Somehow, though, Terry found his voice. "Go away. Our mother told us not to talk to strangers, and we don't know you." "Please, boys, kind boys. Didn't your mother teach you hospitality? Let an old man in out of the cold," he pleaded. "No," Terry said, and moved away from the window as though the man might somehow leap through it. The man didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just sat on the log beneath our tree and continued to whistle. The jagged chords wafted up into the treehouse, and I saw Terry shudder. He picked up a boot that had been part of my costume and went to the window to throw it at the man. Terry sent it sailing, but hissed when it didn't connect. He threw several other things at the whistler, but the old man never seemed to be where he was aiming. Terry cussed loudly, reaching for the lamp. I wrapped my arm around it, begging him not to. "It's all the light we have, Terry. Please." He tore it out of my hand, growling as it came free. He chucked it at the old man, the heavy plastic thing not even getting close to the target. It broke on the ground, shattering and fizzling with an electric pop. The inside of the treehouse was darker for its passing, the three of us now sitting in near darkness. The whistling went on, though. The man never seemed to run out of breath, and the shrill noise took its toll on all of us. Reggie began to rock in the corner, sobbing loudly as the man whistled and whistled below. Terry screamed at him from the window, his rage never ending, as I covered my ears and tried to keep the threads of my sanity together. It seemed to last for hours, for days, and as I sat with my eyes closed, I prayed it would end. When I heard the floorboards creak, I opened my eyes. It was Reggie standing by the window, his foot already on the ledge. "Reggie? What are you doing?" I breathed, half getting up. Reggie looked back at me, snot runners creeping down his face. His naked face looked tortured, tears cutting lines down his dirty cheeks, still streaked with green. He smiled gruesomely at me as he framed himself in the window, and I didn't have to ask what he intended to do. I tried to stop him. I pulled myself up from the floor to go to him, but it was already too late. I just wanted to stop," he breathed, before throwing himself out the window. We never heard him hit the ground over the loud and terrible whistling. Terry stormed over to the hatch and had it unlatched before I could throw myself across it. "What are you doing?" "What do you think I'm doing? I'm gonna go do something about this guy." "He's an adult, Terry. You can't do anything to him." "Get out of my way. I'm going out there." "He's scary, Terry. You shouldn't go out there. You'll end up like Reggie. Terry kicked me, sending waves of pain through my guts, and I rolled off the trap door. I heard him throw it open and toss the ladder down, descending in a shriek of rage as he made his way towards the Whistler. As scared as it had made Reggie, the Whistler had made Terry a furious juggernaut. I drew myself up, my ribs hurting as I hobbled to the trap door. I looked down before closing it and gasped in horror against my throbbing chest. The man was at the bottom of the ladder. His face was still hidden by the coat, his eyes a glistening twosome amidst the swirling dark void, and I could see thick red fluid around the collar of that cloak. He was 2 rungs up the ladder, temporarily frozen by my gaze, and I slammed the hatch and threw the lock a second before he slammed into it. I crawled away from the hatch, seeing it buck wildly and hearing him scream at me to open it. He cussed and howled like an angry animal, wanting to get in, but stopped by the strong bolt that some past child had installed on the sturdy hatch. Maybe they had installed it to keep him out, I thought. My fear overtopped me at some point as I watched the door jump in its frame, and I must have passed out. When the banging woke me up, it was daylight, and I screamed loud enough to startle whoever was banging. "Easy, kid, it's Sheriff Blasky. Are you okay?" I dragged myself to the hatch, my ribs aching, and threw the bolt before falling back, panting. If it was the Whistler, I hoped he was quick at least. My ribs would turn out to be broken, and their healing would encompass 2 of the worst months of my life. Every time I breathed in, I was reminded of the Whistler and that last encounter with Terry. At that moment, though, I didn't care what happened. I just wanted it to end. Sheriff Blasky pushed the flap open, though, and I guessed I'd get to live another day. He took me to the hospital. He took me into the waiting arms of my parents, who pulled me into their warm embrace and threatened to never let me go. I'd been missing for 2 days, they told me, and when the police had seen the state of our treehouse, they feared the worst. They never found any sign of Terry or Reggie. I told them what had happened. I told them about the whistling man, about Reggie's fall, and Terry charging him from the treehouse. I told them about how I'd locked the trap door and passed out as I watched the man trying to batter his way in. They took my statement, searched those woods with officers and dogs and every able-bodied set of legs they could find in town, but they never found anything. Not a scrap of cloth, not a drop of blood. My friends were just gone. That was 8 years ago. I've seen that night in my dreams every night since. The events live on in my memories, and I often wake up screaming as the man tries to break that hatch open. In my dreams, I don't pass out. In my dreams, the hatch doesn't hold. In my dreams, I wake up as he wraps his hands around my throat and drags me towards that pitch-black maw he hides behind his coat. I haven't been back in the forest since that day. I don't think I ever will. Lately, though, I've been hearing the whistling as I lay in bed at night. I look out the window, my backyard butting up to the woods, and see 2 small figures hovering on the outskirts. Sometimes the man in the coat is there too, but I know better than to try to tell my parents. They're gone when they get there, and I just end up looking crazy. I leave for college next week, and I've chosen one in the middle of a big city. I plan to attend it because the closest collection of more than 4 trees is 60 miles from my dorm. I'm hoping that distance will stop this apparition, but I just don't know. I can hear the whistling now, even as I write this. I can hear my dead friend's soft call as they entice me to come out to play. I can hear that whistling as it scrapes across my nerves yet again. I hear it, and I hope that I get to leave for college before it becomes too much for me to bear. I'm not proud of it, but when you receive one of those calls about your car's extended warranty, it's sometimes me. I'm a writer, a published writer, with an agent, a bestseller, and everything. 5 years ago, I was number 3 on several bestseller lists. 5 years ago, Oprah featured my book on her book list. 5 years ago, I sat on Ellen DeGeneres and promoted the crap out of my book, a move that netted me the house I now live in. It was a good year for me, and when my agent suggested that I write a sequel, I jumped at the chance. 5 years later, my sequel is finally coming together, But the bills don't stop just because your royalties and your residuals stop rolling in. My wife went back to her job at the grocery store, something to help pay the bills while I was working on my book. But it just wasn't enough. We had lived a little too grandly for the last 4 years, and now the money was gone. I told her I was paying the bills out of the residuals, but in reality, it was the salary I made working call center jobs like this one. Call center jobs are pretty easy, all things considered. You read a script, you call gullible people and offer them goods and services, you rake in little bonuses when you manage to trick the old or the infirm. It also allows me to work from home so I can proofread pages and research chapters while I cold call people in my pajamas. You get a lot of hate, a lot of people playing games, but that kind of thing is easy to ignore. Hell, I did retail for 8 years when I was young, and it's given me a pretty thick skin. It was easy to ignore when you realized that whether you made the sale or not, you were still going to receive a check at the end of the week. It was a pretty good gig, until I cold called someone I shouldn't have. The voice that picked up the phone was deep, cultured, and I should have known that it wasn't a voice of someone that could be fooled with such a cheap trick. He was the last number on my sheet for the day, and I figured I had nothing to lose. Yes, Sarah, I'm calling you about your car's extended warranty. Do you still own the 2013 Link? Does this ever actually work? I stumbled for a moment, choosing to roll on with the script rather than break character. Lincoln, the warranty is nearing its expiration, and we're offering select customers this is the 5th call I've received from your company today, young man. I started to ignore it, like I'd ignored the others, but I figured I'd pick up this time and see what was so important. I see now that the answer was nothing. I tried to stay in character, but it was hard in the face of his frank honesty. Look, I'm just doing my job, sir. I've got bills to pay and a family to feed, same as you. If you aren't interested, then Oh, a family man! Is that why you take the elderly for their pensions and scam the mentally handicapped for their hard-earned money? Such a provider. I'm sure your children would be proud of their father. He said it in such a matter-of-fact way that I almost didn't register it as an insult. I could have hung up on him. He wasn't the worst offender I'd had all day. But something about his voice rankled me. Where did this guy get off? He was going to sit here and tell me how rotten it was to make my money this way, like I didn't already know? Where the heck did he get off? Look, buddy, there's no reason for any of that. We're just calling to let you know about your warranty program. If you don't want it, then I'll just... He cut me off again. Don't worry about it, friend. I'm sure you'll have more prevalent things to worry about soon enough. Ciao. The line went dead then, and the silence seemed ominous. I sat the phone down like I thought it might blow up. I'd been threatened on the phone before, but this one felt different. There'd been no screaming, no cursing, no invitations to screw myself, or questions about how I slept at night. I shuddered a little, suddenly feeling like a goose had walked over my grave. I jumped a little when I saw my son standing in the doorway, scratching his neck. Michael had wandered into my office while I was on the phone. I turned to him as he stood scratching, his hand moving up and down his back, before asking if he was okay. He'd been napping, something he would have to give up when he started school next year, and it seemed that his itchy back had woken him slightly ahead of schedule. Daddy, my back is so itchy. I told him to go lay in bed while I grabbed the cream and the lotion. His mother and I called it Triceratops cream, something that always made Michael laugh, and it seemed to be the only thing that helped with his eczema when it got really bad. It's something he's suffered with since he was very young. We've had to wash his clothes with dye-free detergent, use special soap during his baths, and stay far away from things like wool. So I grabbed the cream and the lotion so I could lather him up and bring his itching to an end. As I slid his shirt off, however, I worried there might be something else going on here. Michael's back was covered in boils. A swath of small pustules with white heads were scattered over his pink skin, and they looked like pimples. There were clusters of small patches, islands of blight on a sea of normal skin, and I was honestly a little afraid to touch them. Nevertheless, I mixed the cream together and rubbed them onto his back, feeling him jump as some of the boils burst beneath my fingers. He seemed to relax when I finished, thanking me as he slid his shirt down gingerly. That was how it started. I wish I could say that was where it ended. I was proofing pages when my daughter, Michelle, arrived home from school. She stumbled into my office, her hands scratching at the back of her neck absent-mindedly, as she hugged me and told me about her day. We'd done this ever since her first day of school, and it was one of her daily rituals. She'd taken a test she believed she'd done well on, found $1 in the storm grate near the house, and told Jenny that she was being mean to Sara, so the two were no longer friends. I listened to her in a detached way, nodding and mm-hmming as she talked, noticing her scratching her neck a couple of times. The scratching didn't seem peculiar. People scratch sometimes, but I couldn't help but notice the red patch of skin on the back of her neck as she left to go start her homework. I turned back to my work, but sighed as I noticed the time. I saved my work and locked my computer. I had hardly gotten through half the chapter I was working on, but it was time to get started on dinner before my wife got home. The pork chops were cooking in the air fryer when my wife came through the door. I smiled as I turned to pull her against me, kissing the top of her head as she leaned warmly into me. She shuddered a little as my hands touched her back, but said it was just some back pain from standing all day. Mary called out again, so I was the only one working the register. Again. It was 8 straight hours of standing behind the register, listening to people complain. How'd your book proofing go today? I turned away from her, pretending to stir the potatoes as I answered. Stephanie could always tell when I was lying. Pretty good. Lots of progress. I'm sure it'll be ready for my agent in a few weeks. That's fantastic, dear. I'm sure it will be as much of a hit as your last one, she said, pressing a kiss on my stubbly cheek. I smiled, but I really wasn't so sure. It all came down to this latest book, it seemed. I just had to finish my book. I just had to write another hit. I just had to find my way back onto the bestseller list and get myself out of Dutch. Easy, right? The next morning, I awoke determined to get some work done today. I would make up for my lack of work the day before and end with some real progress. I still had over 200 pages to proof, and if I didn't get them done fairly quickly, there would be no time to send them off, and quite likely I'd have to sit through notes on a second draft. As I went to wake my daughter up for school, however, I heard the hoarse cough coming from my son's room. I cracked the door to find him lying on his stomach, his shirt off and his back worse than the day before. His skin was broken out in red, angry boils, and the small white-headed blemishes of the day before had become larger and redder, their tips filled with translucent pus. He was softly moaning, his eyes begging for me to make the pain stop as they pulsated. My wife came out of the bedroom then, getting ready for work, and saw Michael's back. She ran to him, careful not to touch any of the spots, and asked me if he'd had these since yesterday. He was broken out, I said honestly, startled by the sudden appearance of the large angry boils, but it wasn't this bad. I put on lotion and cream, and he seemed to feel a lot better. Stephanie started talking quietly to herself, mostly arguing with herself about whether she could find someone to cover for her. But I told her I could take Michael to the pediatrician. Heck, what was the point of being a stay-at-home husband if I couldn't take my son to the doctor? She asked if I was sure. She knew I had work to do today, but I told her that it was nothing. I told her to go to work and that I would handle things here. I told Michael to stay in bed, not wanting him to aggravate any of the blisters he had on his back, and went to go wake Michelle up so she didn't miss her bus. I was in for another surprise when I got to her room. I opened her door and was immediately buffeted by the sound of her racking cough and her low groans from the bed. She was warm to the touch, not overly so, but definitely fevered, and I asked how she was feeling. She said it felt like she had the flu. Her throat hurt, she was hot, and her whole body ached. My wife was getting ready by then, stepping into the shower before she stepped into her uniform, and I figured it would be just as easy to make an appointment for 2 kids as it would for 1. I told Michelle to get some clothes on, and that I would make an appointment for her and Michael. With all the COVID paranoia still floating around, it was pretty easy to get an appointment last minute with the symptoms they were presenting. 1 phone call to an after-hours nurse later, and I prepared to trade all my editing and proofreading time before work for time spent sitting in the car until it was our turn to go to the back. It was an hour and a half before we made it in, and I tried to make the most of it by doing some edits on my phone. It was slow and tedious, the two of them glued to their phones or their gadgets in the back seat as they hacked and coughed, but I managed to get a little bit of work done before they sent me a text saying they were ready for us in the back. 30 minutes later, their pediatrician came back with very little by way of an explanation. Well, they don't have COVID, or the flu, or anything else that I can test for here. What they do have is a high fever, a very wet cough, and troubling boils all over their back. Michelle too, I asked, having not been aware that she was sporting boils as well. Michelle too, she confirmed. Her outbreak isn't as bad as Michael's, but it's getting worse. I'd recommend that you keep them at home until it clears up. Don't touch the sores with your bare hands, and if you happen to by accident, be sure to disinfect your hands with alcohol. Wear gloves and a mask when you interact with them, and go to the hospital if you or your wife start presenting symptoms. I'm hoping it clears up on its own, but if it doesn't in a day or two, you should take them to the hospital anyway. I bundled them back into the car, a handful of prescriptions in my pocket, and called my wife as I went about getting their medications and getting them home. All of this, the meds, the visit, everything, was going to cost some, and I needed to get them settled so I could log some hours at work. My wife's insurance wasn't very good, and the money I made would be crucial if I wanted to get out of debt. I also had to find some time to work on my book, knowing in the back of my mind that it was the secret to solving my current problems. Stephanie picked up on the third ring, and the cough she rumbled into the phone sounded suspiciously like the ones from the back seat. She swore it was just allergies, and commiserated with me about the diagnosis. She wished she could be there, but said that she would likely be late this evening. Mary had called out, again, and she was the only one working register today. It was noon before I got everyone medicated, set up in their rooms with lunch and toys and entertainment, and sat down at my computer so I could begin my day. As I took calls and proofed pages, I felt a little bubble of anxiety every time someone picked up the phone. I was still a little rattled by yesterday's call, but all of my calls today seemed normal enough. I actually had 2 people give me their information and buy one of the garbage warranties we offered. I had no idea whether they worked or not, but the company was paying me to make calls, not research their products. In between calls, I peeked in on the kids to make sure they were okay. Michael spent most of the day sleeping, his breath heavy and wet, and Michelle just looked at me whenever I peeked in on her, seeming listless and barely there. I gave them more meds and made sure they had juice and liquids, and kept an eye on their temperatures as I took calls in between my nursing duties. As the sun set, I began to get worried about my wife. She should have been home by now, should have been home a half an hour ago, and I was just about to call her when I heard the door pop loudly open. She was laid out on the floor of the living room, her coughs deep and wet, her own blemishes peeking from the collar of her work shirt. I took them all to the hospital then, just bundled them into the car and went. The ER didn't know what to make of them, but we've all been quarantined upstairs now as I try to figure out why I haven't gotten sick with the same symptoms as the rest of my family. They're working hard to manage their fevers. All 3 of them are around 103, and they're laid out on their stomachs as their boils have become very fragile. They're afraid that popping them might lead to sepsis, but the longer I look at them, the more intrigued by them I become. I've been sitting in the room for the last few hours, my only company the beeping of their machines, and as I sat next to my wife, I noticed something strange. The boils on her back seemed to be forming a pattern, the swoops almost looking like a picture. I sat stroking her hand, Stephanie groaning in and out of consciousness, and the longer I looked, the more I realized the swoops are words. Moving over to Michael, I can see he has similar words, all picked out in the pustulant boils that mark his baby-fine skin. I brought my phone out and snapped pictures of their backs, the 3 of them requiring a little turning and moving before the messages were visible. I'm sitting here now as I contemplate telling the doctor what I've found. I don't think it'll help, but I don't know what to make of it either. It can't be what I believe it is, but I can't think of any other explanation for the words that I'm reading swirled across the painful backs of my family. The message reads, "I've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty."
I was a child of the late 80s. This was a time when kids played till the streetlights came on, and riding your bike through town was as normal as going to the corner store to get your mom some smokes. In fact, the woods seemed to be the only place Dad had specifically said was off limits. The woods seemed to be a boundary for many families, and I never knew anyone who went there willingly. It's one of the few things that stayed the same to this day, though so many others have certainly changed since I was a kid. One prime example was the telephone. Coming from a small town, my telephone was on a party line, so if you wanted to talk to your friend, you went to his house and you did it in person. I was pretty fortunate in that respect. My best friend Davey lived right next door. If I wanted to ask him to play G.I. Joes or ride our bikes, I could just walk 20 paces rather than digging my Huffy out of the garage. Unless, we decided to use the tin can phone. The tin can phones were something we had cooked up after watching a science show on TV. The guy on the show had hooked a pair of tin cans together with twine and showed that no matter how far you went, you could still hear the person on the other end of the can. Davey and I had thought that this was just about the coolest thing we had ever seen, and we set about making some for ourselves. I found a pair of old soup cans and a long spool of Mom's twine, and attached the end to the cans. We could hear each other pretty well, a fact that surprised us to no end, but the farther away we got, the harder it became to hear each other. "Let me show you a different way," Dad said, startling us a little since we had been so involved in our little project. He had linked the cans together with some fishing line, and the connection had been the next best thing to crystal clear. We used them a lot, linking our tree houses together with the phones, and we could talk into the night on them as we camped out in different tree houses. It wasn't as clear as a telephone, but it was amazing the conversations we could have over just a simple little device. When Davey got grounded one summer, they became our only means of communication with each other. Davey, you see, had gotten himself into a little bit of trouble. He had gotten addicted to the new arcade that had just come up downtown. The laundromat that had once been there had been cleared out, but I can remember smelling detergent and fabric softener every time I went to play a game of Pac-Man or Galaga. Davey and I went there a lot, but Davey seemed to have developed an unhealthy love for the games. Any money that he could scrape together was shoved into the arcade machine, and I remember noticing that he was absent from school in the middle of the day and suspected that he had snuck off to the arcade. When the truancy officer brought him home around lunchtime one day, his parents finally decided that enough was enough. He was grounded for the summer. They told him that he might manage to earn some of his stuff back with good behavior, but forbid him to go to the arcade until he could get a handle on his addiction. Davey and I talked over the tin can when we could, but Davey made it pretty clear that his parents would take that away if they found it. We would camp out every weekend when the weather was fair, and we talked most of the night, me suddenly being Davey's only real connection to the world. So when I picked up the can one night, calling for Davey through the 100 feet of fishing line, I was surprised to hear someone else pick up right away. As it turned out, though, it wasn't who I was expecting. "Hello?" said a small voice, not like Davey's at all. It sounded like an adult trying to do a bad imitation of a kid's voice. "Who's this?" it said again, and I remember shaking off my uncertainty as I remember that Davey liked to do voices sometimes. Davey and I sometimes listened to the radio DJs prank call people, or we'd catch comedy performances on the satellite TV Davey's family had. Davey had a few characters he'd been working on, despite the fact that they all just kind of sounded like him, and I assumed that this was nothing more than another bad character performance. "Who's this?" I challenged back. "This is Sam," the voice said, still high-pitched, but getting a little surer of itself as the string made it sound tinny and robotic. "But my friends call me Tin Can Sam." Yup, definitely a new voice. If it had been modern day, I would have said that it reminded me of Herbert the Pervert from the Family Guy show. It was 1991, however, and all I could equate it to was the funny way that Michael Jackson talked. The voice was funny, kinda, but it still just sounded like Davey doing a bit. "Okay, well, Sam, why do they call you Tin Can, then?" "'Cause I wear the tin cans I empty like jewelry and clatter everywhere I go. I'm a hobo, you see, and most of my meals are taken from cans. Who do I have the pleasure of conversing with tonight?" I played along and introduced myself to Tin Can Sam. He asked me if I went to school, and I told him that we were out for the summer. He asked if I lived around here, and I told him I lived next door. He asked me how old I was, and if I knew the kid who owned the treehouse, and a dozen other things as I played along. Some of you guys will think this is weird. Why would I surrender a lot of information to Davey that he would already have, especially if he was doing a bit? Well, to answer that question, you'd have to understand how Davey was when he was doing a character. Davey was one of those people who would commit to a role. If he was doing a new character, that person didn't know you. Interacting with him was like meeting Davey all over again. But he was my friend, so I put up with it. At least it wasn't Grandma Gerda, who had a memory problem and constantly forgot the things you told her. So I played along with the game, asking Sam what it was like to be a hobo. "It's all right, I guess. I used to own a hardware store, but the people didn't like me very much, so I had to leave. It's rough not having a house sometimes, but I meet so many interesting people on the road." "What do you do for fun?" I asked, nodding to myself at how thoroughly Davy had committed to the role.
"Tell stories mostly. Sit around the fire at night and eat your dinner and tell tales. We especially like scary stories."
"Scary stories?" I asked, a little taken aback. Davy was not a fan of scary stories. He liked to play it cool, but he was a bit of a scaredy cat at the core of it all. When we watched the scary movies sometimes, the volume low so his parents didn't catch us, Davy always hid his eyes and sobbed sometimes when the killer got somebody. Sam liking scary stories was not something I was prepared for.
"Do you like scary stories?"
Sam asked, his voice sounding hungry for the answer. "Yeah, I like scary stories."
"I got a real scary one if you'd like to hear it."
I nodded before realizing he wouldn't be able to see me and told him that I did. I was still absolutely sure that this was Davy doing a bit, but the longer I listened, the less sure that I was becoming. The longer I listened, the more the voice sounded less like Davy and more like a stranger.
"Good, 'cause it's a real scary story. It's about these kids who were camping in the woods one night. They didn't have a tree house like you, but a tent instead. They had set up far from town where they lived, and they camped at the site often. They came there for a sleepover one night, but they didn't know that there was an extra in their party this time."
I sat on the fluffy orange rug I had taken after Mom was going to throw it out and felt my teeth trying to chatter. If this was a bit that Davy was doing, then it was better than usual. As the string brought his words to me, I remember feeling my spine shudder in my back. This was different. Way different. And I wasn't entirely sure that I liked it.
"As I came up, they heard me. They looked out to see what was making so much noise, peeking from the zipper as they looked into the once inviting woods. It was dark, though, and the woods were dense. As I moved about, rattling and shaking, they kept looking around anxiously, trying to figure out where I was. The more I moved, the more it scared them. They thought I was a ghost or some sort of spook, and the longer I rattled, the more they shivered. It was windy that night, and I seemed to be everywhere."
Oh, okay, Davy," said my voice shaking a little as I watched the fire and my lantern dance. I don't like this game anymore."
"Who's Davy? I told you my name's Tin Can Sam. Now where was I?"
I looked out the window, trying to see if Davy was in his treehouse, but the branches of the big oak his dad had built it in obscured the structure. All I could really see was the string as it hung taut between us.
"Oh, that's right. I could hear them whispering over there, discussing their chances if they ran. They didn't think they stood a chance if they stayed, but if they ran, well, they believed I could only catch one of them. They were arguing, starting to yell, and as they got louder and louder, I crept up to their tent. I'd have had them then and there, but suddenly they burst out of the tent and ran in every direction. I smiled as they ran, knowing that I could easily catch more than one of them.
"Stop it, Davy," I yelled, the story creeping me out, and when coupled with the voice he told it in, I don't want to hear any more. Despite this, I felt unable to take the can away from my ear.
"I caught them, and I cut them. I sliced them, and I diced them. I cut their throats, and I sliced out their tongues. I cut their legs, and I took off their fingers, and when I turned my attention to the third boy, I knew I could get him before he got home. I took off after him, my cans rattling like ghostly chains. He kept glancing behind him, hearing my clatter as I got closer and closer. His feet slapped against the ground, and if he'd hit a single root, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I was so close, my knife still wet with his friend's blood, and as I lunged, he jumped over a small fence and came into his backyard. I stood, watching as he tripped and rolled onto the grass of his house, and when he looked back, I melted into the woods. His race won.
I let the tin can fall to the rug, not wanting to hear anything else as I scrambled to the ladder to my treehouse and pulled it up.
Unlike the children in the story, I was not in a tent. I knew that no one could get me if that ladder was up, and as I dragged it into the treehouse, I could see a shadow as it hunkered at the edge of the fence that separated my yard from Davy's. It was a man, a skinny wisp of a man, with strings of cans hanging off him. He looked up at me as I looked down at him, and even in the dark, I could see his broad white teeth as he grinned. I slammed the trapdoor shut, but even in my tree fort, I wasn't outside his reach. As I hunkered on the carpet, I heard his voice ooze from the can as he left one final word on the matter.
"Tell your father he was right to tell you to be cautious of the woods."
He may have said more, but I threw the can out the window then and heard it tonk as it landed in Davy's yard. I spent the rest of the night with my knees against my chest, jumping at every sound outside as I listened for the clank of cans. I didn't come out when the sun came up, and when someone called my name from the ground, I jumped in surprise. Looking out my window, I was happy to see that it was my dad. I came down the ladder, leaping into his arms as I cried against his shoulders. "What's the matter, kiddo? You have a bad night?" he asked, smiling but clearly concerned. I felt him stiffen when I told him what Tin Can Sam had said, and I felt him hug me even tighter. "I'm so sorry," he said. I never slept in that treehouse again, and after I told Davy about what had happened, I don't think he did either. I'm an adult now, and my parents' house is my house. After Dad died of a stroke while I was in college and Mom passed away a few years later, Melinda and I decided to move into what was the largest part of my inheritance. Our children love the big backyard, the treehouse that I've refurbished and repaired, but I always warned them to stay out of the woods. They always begged to be allowed to explore, but I've put my foot down where the woods are concerned. I've never seen Tin Can Sam again, but if I ever think that maybe I imagined it, all I have to do is listen carefully on quiet nights. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the clank and jangle of the old cans as they blow in the breeze.